There are bad video game launches, there are commercial flops, and then there is Concord, a game that launched, collapsed, and effectively disappeared within the space of 2 weeks. Concord released for PlayStation 5 and PC on August 23rd, 2024. On September 3rd, Sony announced that sales were stopping immediately, every customer would receive a refund, and the servers would be taken offline. On September 6th, just 14 days after release, the game officially became unplayable. That is almost unheard of for a major first-party PlayStation release. This wasn't some unfinished Steam game made by 3 people in a basement. Concord was backed by Sony, developed by a studio filled with experienced multiplayer developers, and positioned as part of PlayStation's enormous expansion into live service gaming. And yet, it failed so spectacularly that Sony didn't even attempt to leave the service running while it worked out what to do next. So how did this happen? How did PlayStation look at Concord, invest in the studio, market it as a major new franchise, and apparently fail to notice that almost nobody was interested? Because Concord's disaster wasn't caused by one bad decision, it was the result of Sony misunderstanding the market, misreading its audience, and building an entire franchise around a game that had never earned anyone's attention. To understand Concord, you have to understand the period in which it was conceived. Throughout the late 2010s, live service games appeared to represent the future of the industry. Fortnite was generating absurd amounts of money. Overwatch had turned the hero shooter into one of gaming's biggest genres. Destiny had demonstrated that a console-focused shooter could keep players engaged for years. Every major publisher wanted its own version of that success. The problem is that games take years to make. By the time a company identifies a trend, hires a team, builds its technology, and finally releases its products, the market may have completely changed. This is exactly what happened with Concord. Its development history reportedly stretched back several years, with the frequently repeated figure being around 8 years for the project's broader journey. Sony eventually acquired Firewalk Studios in April 2023, describing the team as a group of experienced developers creating an original AAA multiplayer game for PS5 and PC. But by 2024, audiences were no longer desperately waiting for another hero shooter. They already had Overwatch 2, Valorant, Apex Legends, Rainbow Six Siege, Destiny, Fortnite, Call of Duty, and countless other multiplayer games competing for their attention. Concord wasn't entering an empty market. It was walking into one of the most overcrowded markets in gaming and asking players to abandon games in which they had already invested hundreds, sometimes thousands of hours. To succeed in that environment, being decent isn't enough. You need to give people an extremely convincing reason to leave the game they already loved. Concord never provided that reason. The public's first substantial look at Concord came during PlayStation's May 2024 State of Play. Sony opened with an extended cinematic sequence introducing a colourful group of space mercenaries called the Free Gunners. The obvious influence was Guardians of the Galaxy. Sarcastic characters, retro science fiction, technology, constant banter, and a group of dysfunctional criminals flying around space together. For several minutes, it looked like PlayStation might be revealing a story-driven science fiction adventure. Then the gameplay started, and it was another 5 versus 5 hero shooter. You could almost feel the excitement leaving the room. The transition perfectly captured Concord's identity problem. Sony appeared to believe the characters and universe were already interesting enough to carry the reveal, but audiences had no existing relationship with any of them. The game was introducing itself as though these characters were already beloved. They weren't. Players didn't know their names, personalities, relationships, or motivations. They were watching an expensive cinematic filled with jokes and emotional beats for a franchise that technically didn't even exist yet. Then, once the gameplay appeared, the immediate question became, what does Concord offer that I can't already get somewhere else? And the answer wasn't obvious. It had different heroes with unique weapons and abilities, team-based objectives with colourful maps and a science fiction setting, but those were no longer selling points. Those were basic requirements for entering the genre. Concord looked technically polished but creatively familiar. It resembled a mixture of Overwatch, Destiny, and Guardians of the Galaxy without possessing the instantly recognizable identity of any of them. One of the most discussed elements of Concord was its character design, and this conversation became incredibly toxic incredibly quickly. Some people blame the game's failure entirely on diversity or called it woke, which is an extremely lazy explanation. Diverse casts do not automatically cause games to fail, just as putting conventionally attractive characters into a bad game does not automatically make it successful. The more important issue was that Concord's characters did not create enough desire. In a hero shooter, the characters are the product. Players need to look at the roster and immediately think, that character looks cool. I want to play as them. I want to master their abilities. I might even buy a skin for them. Overwatch understood this perfectly even before release. Characters such as Tracer, Reaper, Mercy, and Winston had strong silhouettes, clear personalities, and instantly readable roles. Concord's roster often felt deliberately ordinary. Several characters wore practical clothing, muted colours or costumes that looked more like background characters from a science fiction television series than the stars of a major competitive game. That may have been an intentional artistic choice, but it was a disastrous commercial one. The designs weren't necessarily technically bad. They were detailed, well animated, and clearly expensive. They simply weren't aspirational, and in a genre built around choosing a hero, becoming attached to them, and potentially spending money customizing them, that is a serious problem. Reviews frequently acknowledge that Concord had solid shooting mechanics, while criticizing its forgettable characters, limited personality, weak progression, and lack of a distinctive gameplay hook. Concord didn't give players something to hate, it gave them something worse: characters they felt nothing about. Sony also decided to release Concord as a £34.99 or $39.99 premium game. On paper, there was an argument for this. A lower price premium release could potentially avoid some of the aggressive monetization associated with free-to-play games. It could give players access to the full experience without locking characters behind endless grinding or expensive battle passes. But commercially, it created another barrier. Most of Concord's largest competitors were free. Overwatch 2, Valorant, Apex Legends, and Fortnite were free. Concord was asking people to pay before they even knew whether they liked it. And the multiplayer game doesn't just need customers, it needs a community. A single player game can sell slowly, someone can discover it 6 months later and still receive the complete experience. A competitive multiplayer game requires a healthy population immediately. It needs full servers, balanced matchmaking, social media discussion, streamers, guides, and friends persuading other friends to join. Every barrier to entry makes that harder. The £35 price wasn't outrageous in isolation, but Concord was not being judged in isolation. Players looked at Concord, looked at the free games they were already enjoying, and saw very little reason to take the risk. The most shocking part of the Concord story is that Sony received a clear warning before launch. During the game's open beta in July 24, Concord reached an all-time peak of only 2,388 concurrent players on Steam. That was during a beta that people could try without buying the full game. Those numbers should have triggered an emergency. A beta is partly a technical test, but it is also one of the best indicators of public interest. If people are not willing to download your multiplayer game when it is free, convincing them to pay £35 1 month later is going to be incredibly difficult. Sony continued with the release anyway, and at launch, Concord peaked at only 697 concurrent players on Steam. That doesn't represent the entire audience because PlayStation numbers were never publicly available, but for a major Sony published multiplayer shooter launching simultaneously on PC, it was catastrophic. Analysts later estimated that Concord may have sold fewer than 25,000 copies across PlayStation and PC. Although Sony never officially confirmed that figure, the exact number almost doesn't matter. Sony's decision to stop sales and refund every customer after less than 2 weeks tells you everything you need to know. The company clearly believed the game's population was too small to sustain matchmaking, support future content, or justify continued operation. Concord was not an isolated experiment, it was part of PlayStation's wider attempt to expand beyond the premium single-player games for which the brand had become famous. Sony originally planned a large slate of live service releases. By November 23, the company had already reduced its target, saying it now intended to release 6 of 12 planned titles by its 2025 financial year, while reviewing whether the remaining games met player expectations. The logic behind the strategy was understandable. Games such as God of War, Spider-Man, and The Last of Us can sell millions of copies, but most of their revenue arrives around release. A successful live service game can continue generating income for years. The problem is that publishers often look at Fortnite and see recurring revenue without appreciating how extraordinarily difficult it is to build another Fortnite. Live service games compete for something more limited than money. They compete for your time. Most people cannot maintain 5 different online games simultaneously. They normally have 1 or 2 favorites, and every new release must persuade them to abandon an existing routine, an existing community, and potentially years of unlocked content. Sony actually demonstrated how to do this properly with Helldivers 2. Helldivers 2 succeeded because it had a clear identity. Its cooperative warfare, chaotic friendly fire, satirical propaganda, and community-driven galactic campaign gave players experiences they could not easily find elsewhere. Concord offered another competitive hero shooter. One game felt like an event, the other felt like a product category. Sony later acknowledged this contrast directly, telling investors that Helldivers 2 had been a major success while Concord had been shut down, and that the company intended to share lessons from both projects across its studios. On October 29, 2024, Sony announced that Concord would not be returning. Firewalk Studios was closed entirely. Sony said the competitive first-person shooter market was constantly evolving and that Concord had failed to meet its targets. The company also said it would take the lessons learned from Concord and improve its live service capabilities in the future, and this is where the story starts being funny. It's easy to turn Concord into a meme. The player numbers were absurdly low. The 2-week lifespan was unprecedented. Even after the game disappeared, an animated Concord episode still released as part of Amazon's secret level anthology on December 17th, 2024, like an advertisement for a franchise that no longer existed. But behind all of that were developers who spent years building the game, artists created environments, animators produced cinematics, programmers built the networking technology, designers balanced characters, writers created an entire science fiction universe. Those people did not decide Sony's broader corporate strategy. They did not control the market, and many of them ultimately lost their jobs. That is what makes Concord such an important failure. It demonstrates how publishers can approve enormous projects, allow them to continue for years, and then place the consequences almost entirely on the development team when the strategy collapses. Concord failed because practically every major decision made its situation harder. It entered an overcrowded genre years after the market had matured. It lacked a clear gameplay hook. Its characters failed to create an emotional connection. Its reveal assumed players were already invested in a universe they had only just discovered. Its premium price created friction in a free-to-play market. Its open beta demonstrated extremely low interest, yet the launch continued without a fundamental change in strategy. And above everything else, Sony appeared to build Concord as a franchise before establishing Concord as a game people actually wanted. There were weekly cinematic ambitions, long-term content plans, an animated television episode, a universe, lore, characters, and merchandise potential, but there wasn't an audience. Concord wasn't simply a bad game. By most accounts, the shooting was competent, the production values were strong, some of the people who actually played it genuinely enjoyed it, but competent is not enough in the live service market. You are not merely asking someone to buy your game, to restructure their free time around it, or to stop playing something else. You are asking their friends to join them. And Concord never produced a convincing answer to the simplest question any customer can ask. Why should I play this instead? Sony spent years answering every question except that one, and by the time it finally received the answer from players, Concord had already become one of the biggest disasters in PlayStation history.